All right, everybody, hello and welcome. Our project was on deploying and optimizing a virtual desktop infrastructure using VMware Horizons. I'd like to first start out by introducing our team from the University of Wisconsin-Stout. My name is Chris Spieth, and I was the team lead.
I'm Song Jun, I'm a system engineer.
I'm Tim Kissling, I'm the storage engineer.
This is Austin Top, network engineer.
I'd also like to introduce our sponsor from Dell. We had Jacob Medford, Mike Madsen, and Steve Holm, all of which are master engineers.
So this is agenda of our presentation. First, we start with the technical background, and then we are going to explain about project goals, requirement, and then overall plan. And then we have a technical demonstration with some topologies, and testing and optimization, revised statement of work, and final conclusion.
So Dell's challenge to us was for a fictional company called Pandemonium. And Pandemonium is having a 200% increase in the amount of desktop users at their company. All of those users now need to operate on a virtual desktop environment. That virtual desktop environment needs to be based in their existing hardware. And despite that existing limited hardware resources that we have, it needs to be stable for the users at the end of the day. Now, when we think about the traditional desktop architecture, I think of the behemoth that sits under your desk, gathering dust. That's really kind of a thorn in the side of the administrator that has to upgrade the hardware, image it, that type of thing. So what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is virtual desktop infrastructure, which is something you'll hear referenced quite a bit in this presentation. Basically, you can think about it like this. You take your CPU and RAM and storage, and you pull that out of your desktop, and that power is going into your data center, into your servers. So what the user gets is an image pushed out from that server room to a small terminal, a thin client, for example, on their desk rather than that behemoth desktop. The other thing is, besides the physical space savings just from having a smaller type of client for the user, you also have some potential savings in purchasing the hardware. Now, as far as that goes, what we needed to deliver to Pandemonium and our sponsor Dell at the end of the day, as I mentioned, was a stable desktop infrastructure that made the most of the hardware resources that we could give it. In other words, optimize. Again, what we also had to do was maximize the number of desktops that were going to be available because they have a lot more users coming online. And at the end of the day, too, we also needed to make sure that group policy had specific implementations for the 3 desktop types which Pandemonium needed, which were admins, users, and kiosk stations.
So now we're going to move into some of the technical requirements. So VMware ESXi 6.0 is running on all our servers because it is required for Horizon 7. We will be running updated Windows 7 images for all of our VMs. And then we also ran into the issue of persistency. So we have those 3 desktops Tim was talking about, and the kiosk ones need to be non-persistent. What that means is every time that kiosk desktop is logged out of, that desktop is wiped out, and when you log into it the next time, it's completely new. However, with admins and end users, we wanted them to keep that same desktop every time they logged in and out, and that's where that persistency comes into play.
So this is a project plan and overview. First, we deploy the basic IT infrastructure we went over, and then we install the VMware Horizons and its components required to learn. And then we create the 3 desktop user groups, admin, end user, and kiosk. Then finally, we optimize the desktop for the best user experiences with scalability.
So as Song said, we're going to actually move into that first one. We're going to talk a little bit about our topology here. So as you see up in the top, we had Cisco ISR and a 2960 switch. This is purely for our networking purposes to get out so we could VPN in and do remote access. And then down towards the bottom, we have the servers that Dell got us. So on the actual infrastructure side, we had those 2 Dell NX3000s, which housed our virtualization for things like Active Directory, SQL, things we'll talk about a little bit more. And then on that right side, we have the VDI infrastructure, and this was purely 2 Dell R310 servers, purely for deploying these desktops. And that's where the challenge comes in. Between those 2 desktops, we had a total of 16 gigs of RAM. And we'll go into more about that a little bit. And then at the bottom, we have our Dell Compelling SAN, which is just a storage area network. And then we also have a fiber switch for the switching between that SAN and our servers.
So now we'll move into step 2 of our project, which was actually installing the Horizons software. So to start with, what is Horizons? Horizons is VMware's take on a VDI solution. It provides end users access to desktops and applications through a single client, as shown up there. Now, let's look at it from a system administrator's point of view. Traditional desktops, as Tim had talked about, are clunky, big, gather dust, which is kind of shown here in the middle. Now, it's still pretty common to see this in most industries, but you're starting to see this move into a BYOD environment where end users can bring their own devices. This is great for the end users as they are comfortable for what they get to use, but as a system administrator, it's a headache. There's no guarantee that our programs are going to work on all these different hardware that our end users are bringing in. This is the solution that VMware Horizons can solve. We can now access all of our desktops using any HTML5 device, which basically all devices nowadays are an HTML5 device. With that, we also get some other benefits. We can roll out patches now by only updating one desktop, which rolls out to all of our desktops. And also we can do rollouts of new users in a matter of clicks instead of spending hours trying to image new desktops. So let's look at the components of Horizons here. In the center, we have our VMware virtualization using vCenter. With this is the core of all our virtualization technologies, including Horizons. We now look at Active Directory. Active Directory and vCenter will do all the communications in order for our virtual environment to run. We then add a database backbone, which is required for Horizons to function using Microsoft SQL. Now let's look at our two new components, Horizons Connections and Horizons Composer. Horizons Connections is what our desktop clients will be able to be connecting into in order to access their desktops, whereas Horizons Composer is what actually composes and spins up the desktops. So from an end user's perspective, they get to use HTML5 devices such as iPads, Chromebooks, Chrome bases, or thin clients like the ones up there. We then add in the Horizon client, which they can log in and access their desktops, and you end up with this the end user experience, which looks like this, like Windows 7 running on an iPad.
So now we're going to move into that third step where we actually created these desktop pools and what they needed on them and what they looked like. So we had three ones, as we talked about earlier. So we had an admin one, which is for obviously administrative tasks, things like managing SQL, managing web servers, things like that. And then we had our end user, which would be that everyday employee, so they needed things like Office, Chrome, Skype. And then we had our kiosk pools, which really talk where that GPL comes into play. These need to be very secure things. The idea behind them was for a public space, and so they needed to be locked down and they couldn't be tampered with. And so on there, the only viable thing you can do with it is actually browse the web with Chrome. And actually, we're going to go in and show an example here that Chris is going to take over here and he's going to log us into our connection server and we're actually going to spin up a kiosk desktop pool. Unfortunately, for the sake of time, we can't show you every possible feature and thing with it, so we might be skipping areas and we're just leaving settings as default.
1 second.
So hopefully, looks like we're having issues with the dual desktop. So I guess we'll just start. But it's really nice. It's something very easy. And usually to make all these separate VMs, usually you'd have to go in and make them each individually, one at a time by yourself. And that's just not viable. And that's why it's really nice that we have this ability to create these giant pools that are connected in with Active Directory. So as you can see here, we're going to go ahead and add it in. And right off the bat, so automated versus manual. So whether or not you want these computers to be spun up on their own, or if you really want to control it and you only are allowed to make more VMs when you decide with a manual pool. So we'll move on here. And this is where that persistency I was talking about earlier really comes into play. Dedicated pools will always be persistent, meaning you get that same desktop, where floating ones will always be wiped out each time. So, and then obviously after this, so the next big part, it's all right, because it takes a second to explain this next part. So we have vCenter. So some environments run multiple vCenter servers if you have lots of VMs, lots of resources. In our case, we only used one, but it actually allows you to choose where these resources are coming from and which vCenter you want to use. And then as we move on, so now this is always, you gotta name it, give it something unique, identifiable, something that you will be able to identify this pool, and you'll know exactly who's using it and who should be available to it. As we move on, these are some of those default settings I was talking about. These can be changed based on user preference or whatever you decide. Next, so Horizons is very nice. They make it very easy to spin them up. They also make it very easy to name them. So as you can see here, if you put that N in brackets, now every time a new machine is spun up, it'll be called K1, K2, and it'll just increase that number. So it makes it very easy to have a really identifiable naming scheme. And then, so the max size pool. So obviously you don't want 300 kiosk pools and no end user pools. You can actually max these out, and it will not allow any more to be created after the fact. This is really nice though, because you can go back in and change this later if you need to do additional configuration, if you decide you need more or less. And then also provisioning happens here. So there's the ability to do it upfront, meaning you will provision the max amount of machines as soon as this pool is ready to go and you're finished with it. Otherwise, there's on demand. And this means it will spin them up as they are required. As people try to log into them, it'll create new machines. But however, the draw from that is that it takes a couple of minutes to spin one up, but the draw from doing dedicated is you're having resources that you could be using just sitting there. And obviously in our case, we don't want that. So as we move on, this is part of our project deliverables were these templates that are already optimized and ready to go. So as you can see up there, we've got a couple. Obviously, we're going to grab the kiosk one, and then next we're going to choose the location of where this VM is stored. So every time a new VM is spun up, it's stored on your vCenter server. And as you can see there, we got a nice little folder all ready to go. And the next is the infrastructure. So this is where those resources are coming from. We have our 2 clusters. We have VDI and infrastructure. Obviously, because we're spinning up VDI machines, we want to pull our resources from that VDI cluster, which were those R310s we talked about earlier. And then same next here when we get to the data store. So Dell provided us with a SAN. I'd like to say a nice SAN, but it's a SAN. It has plenty of storage, which is a part of it. But as you can see there, we have our VDI. It has 4 terabytes of storage. It's just a matter of how fast we can get to it. And then, again, some additional settings. Now this is where another part of our deliverables is these customizations. So obviously, whenever you make a new image of Windows, you need to register your Windows 7. It needs to be genuine. You need to add it to a domain, all these other things. And customization just automatically does it for us. They'll automatically get added right into that domain. Now that we figured out how to do it, we ran into a lot of issues with that we'll talk a little bit about more later. And then here we're finished up. Unfortunately, because like I said, it does take a couple of minutes to revision, about 5 minutes. So for the sake of time, we're going to use an already made VM. And Tim and Song here are actually going to walk you through and show you what that kiosk pool looks like.
Thanks, Austin. I kind of have the light touch of a German jazz band, so I'm going to let Song take the wheel here. She's using the VMware Horizon connection client to log in. And basically what she's going to do as a user is select one of those kiosk type desktops. And you can think of the kiosk as really a limited functionality desktop, something you place in a public space like a lobby, where basically all it does is you log in as a user and you open it. Google Chrome actually opens automatically for simple web browsing. And if you look at the start menu, you'll see that there are no other applications available or installed on this desktop type. So really at the end of the day, it's a disposable web browsing station. As soon as Song were to log off here, the next person that logs onto a kiosk gets a brand new desktop. There's no real data that's stored. As Austin would say, it's non-persistent.
So now we're going to move on here and actually talk about a little bit how we optimize and some of the things we looked at to really use those very few resources we had. So right off the bat, RAM, that was definitely our bottleneck, that was our problem. So we looked at how much we could provision to each of these VMs and pools and how that would affect it. Then we had the same thing with CPU. We looked at if we gave it more CPU, would it matter? Is the RAM unfortunately too much of a bottleneck? Can we actually do something with it? Then we also looked at the pools themselves. So dedicated versus floating, did they require more resources? Was provisioning them upfront better or on demand? Which one was definitely more effective? And then we looked at GPOs. We were required to have a really locked down GPO for kiosk, but we also took the option to look at the admin and end user and see if there were other things we could do in those GPOs that would actually help us along. And then operating system. Initially, Windows 10 was part of our requirements for the admin desktop pool. However, we found the absolute minimum we could get that running on was 4 gigabytes of RAM, which was nearly half of our available RAM. So it was not really viable, and we chose to go Windows 7 on all of our machines. And then the optimization tool. Now, this is a really fantastic tool. It's a third-party tool, but VMware really endorses it. It helps clean up the Windows image like you would not believe. It disables things that people don't even know are there, like arrow theme. It's something that Windows does that makes your animation and your bars look nicer, it makes them see-through. However, it's actually really intensive resource-wise, and it really doesn't need to be there. And it also removes unnecessary services, unnecessary programs like Windows Media Player, and a lot more. We do have white paper documentation on all of the changes it made. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through each and every one right now as much as I would like to.
Now, part of that optimization test, of course, or optimization, is actually testing how your changes to those desktop types affect how they perform. So basically what we wanted to do was look at how the individually installed programs on the 3 desktop types would use the CPU and RAM resources as those programs were running. For example, the admin type desktop only had SQL Manager, Apache Web Server Manager, whereas the other desktops didn't. Kiosks, as we saw earlier, just have Chrome installed. So we wanted to see how each of those programs on their respective desktops would use the resources. So we pull up Task Manager and look at Resource Manager as they were running. And really what we found is that a good or bad user experience wasn't necessarily reflected by how those resources were used. And what it came down to finding out was that really to do testing, it's pretty much subjective. Does this seem slow? Does this, does it make me want to tear my hair out as I'm trying to type into the web bar, or is it real slick? That's really what we found at the end of the day through testing.
So through our testing policies and procedures, we ran into quite a few issues. The first is ESXi's overhead. ESXi had an overhead of about 4 gigs on each of our servers, which left us with only 8 usable gigs for our desktops. This allowed us to not be able to provision our desktops on demand due to RAM ballooning. If it balloons above a certain point, vSphere will completely shut down the process of provisioning that pool. Second was power outages. You're going to hear this from a couple groups today, but we ran into a series of 3 power outages which knocked out our SAN. During this time, we lost 3 days that we could have been testing to doing troubleshooting. Finally, domain customization. We had a lot of issues with our machines wanting to join the domain on provision. This was due to a DNS issue, which I learned quite a bit about DNS while doing this.
So let's talk about our actual results. So we did find one virtual core was always most effective. Adding more cores in really didn't help anything. However, with RAM, we found that to be a lot more variable. So Kiosk could be ran on half a gig of RAM. It had an optimal experience. It was able to run, but it didn't take up all of our resources. However, we found that not to be the case with admin and the end user computers. They required absolutely a 1 gig minimum. A lot of their applications would not run without it. And while they would run for especially admin, we found it not to be the real great experience. You could do it, but I would definitely say a more optimal experience came in when we were using 2 gigabytes for those desktops.
So this is a testing conclusion. While all the hardware is capable of running VDI environment, but it is not recommended and should be limited in very specific cases. Also, the hardware we had was not sufficient for the Pandemonium required deliverables. However, we got thrown a curveball here. So midway through our project, our company had the fictional merger with another company to Opoly. So we got the increase in user here. So with this increase in user, we got the additional budget for the potential hardwares. So this is included the Dell R630, which have 64 gigs of RAM each. So it is expected to alleviate the RAM bottlenecking. Also, we got additional hardwares to handle the increased throughput.
So as Song was saying, that was going to be giving some really, really nice new equipment to Stout here next semester. And so this really rapidly became a proof of concept study. And immediately off the bat, we took a look at those server specs, and they're really nice, super fantastic. However, we wanted to keep our redundancy, and we found we didn't need 128 gigs of RAM purely for our infrastructure. We immediately decided it would make more sense to re-provision half of that RAM over into our VDI cluster, which left us with about 192 gigabytes dedicated purely to VDI. However, 8 of that is still gone right away to ESXi, and then we decided that having 10 admins at about 2 gigs each, 32 kiosks at half a gig each, left us with about 150 possible end users running machines on 1 gig each.
So due to limited time, we weren't able to look into all possible optimization features, so here's a couple that we would have liked to look into. The first is an RDS application. This allows us to run resource-intensive applications in our server side or infrastructure side. This would have allowed us to limit the amount of strain that would have been going on our virtual desktops and move it over to our server side. The second was our linked clones. Linked clones would have allowed us to use shared Windows files amongst our virtual machines. This would have allowed us to alleviate some network throughput as well as limit the amount of hard drive space needed on our SAN.
So to give you an idea of the time that really went into this project, we started at the end of January with our first initial meeting as a group. By mid-February, in fact, we actually did have our ESXi infrastructure going. We had AD going. That was our main server infrastructure. And by the end of February, we had the virtual desktop infrastructure up and running, which is namely VMware Horizons. March was really the month for testing, troubleshooting, and optimizing those desktop images, really the core task of our presentation. The middle of March, of course, was taken up a little bit by spring break, and when we came back, we found the horrifying situation of a power outage that knocked out our storage area network. So, after a day's troubleshooting of that, we continued on with the testing. By roughly April 1st, we had finished our testing and optimizing stage, and we began to prepare our white paper and presentation.
So for this project, we worked 254 hours in total.
Get this clicker to work here. All right, so we learned quite a few life lessons from this. For me personally, I learned being a leader meant designating tasks. A lot of times I like to try to do most things, but for this task, it was a lot easier to help designate them, which made it easier on me in the end.
First of all, I'm an international student, so I want to thank my whole team members for understanding me. Also, it was great experiences to learn many interesting technologies.
You know, I learned that I think I have a new set of lifelong friends for many reasons. Chris, I mean, he's a tremendous leader. I mean, he just did a fantastic job really bringing the group together. Song, it was great to work with an international student. I think there was some cultural exchange that ultimately went on there. Austin, I think I can always count on this guy for tech support. He knows his stuff, and he showed his technical prowess. So I was really happy to work with all these guys.
Yeah, and I learned lots of things, not least of which is how much better than I am of them at pool. It was a little embarrassing, but I also learned how important communication is. I know it's already been said by Travis, and I know it'll probably get said in every presentation today, but it's just so important. I showed up twice to meetings we weren't having because nobody said anything. We had all these different email chains saying different things, people coming at different times, and it's super not cool. I showed up and I sat there for like an hour and I'm like, really? Really? But even outside of just meetings, things like that, like making sure we didn't have multiple people working on the same thing only to come to the same conclusion when we could have been doing something, that it's so important and it cannot be understated.
So moving to conclusions here. At the end of the day, we were able to provide Pandemonium a functional virtual desktop environment, even though we had very limited hardware. With this virtual desktop environment, we were able to provide optimized templates that gave a great end user experience. We were then able to implement those virtual desktops into a potential future hardware situation. So we'd like to say a quick thank you here to Holly, the UW Stout CNIT program, as well as our sponsors at Dell for our equipment we have, as well as the future equipment we will be getting. And with that, we'll now open it to questions. Yes.
So now that you get,
Go ahead.
I was just wondering, with the RAM, is that statically allocated, or is that like a limit that you set for those workstations?
So you can, we decided that we'd put a top end, you could statically allocate the top end of the RAM, but like you could let it go down to a certain point. If actually our white paper goes out and demonstrates this really well of how we would probably let it get down to like, for depending on the desktop, as low as 256 megs, so it would still be functional.
So how much did you guys learn on this project as far as an end user? I mean, you always want, like, I just want local admin rights on my machine so I can do whatever I want, because that makes my life easier. But you guys are looking at this from the other side of the looking glass. So how much do you guys appreciate what sysadmins have to do now as far as locking stuff down and making it difficult for me?
I think Austin can handle this one pretty well.
I learned how horrific GPOs can be. There's 3,500 possible options, which I almost thought I was going to have to type out word for word. Luckily enough, you can export them. That would have been a really long couple of weeks. But it's really rough. There are a lot of possible options, and I've seen the absolute worst of what people can do if you give them the ability to do anything. Obviously, you know, in our case, your case especially, being good at the computer, it's really nice to have that control when you have it, but people who don't know what they're doing, who have that control, they will find a way to mess it up. And it's why it's really nice that Microsoft has this thing where you can go in and set these and be like, no, you can't do this, you can't do this. And then not have to go and do that for each individual person, but then make groups and really add them in and keep it down to this one thing. And it's just, it's so nice, it really is.
Yes.
So did you do any monitoring or testing to see how much network bandwidth per user session it'll take up on your LAN, not on the storage side, but on the user LAN side?
We did not, and this was due to, we couldn't, I guess for us, we noticed that the RAM had caused such a bottleneck on our end that we couldn't really get like an accurate picture of what the actual network utilization would be, because we could only, at most, I think we got up to like 12 desktops going on our environment. Could we maybe have gone on a per desktop basis? Possibly, but that was something we did not look into.
Okay. And did you all do any testing about what happens if you simultaneously start up a large number of systems? Like in the
Yes.
So that goes into that provisioning. So we can set up you notice if you saw, we can set it up where we can have this many desktops spun up as a ready to go right away. So like, let's say I have a bunch of end users, they log off at night, it'll automatically re-provision that amount that we feel would be necessary for that next morning when all of them log in. So that way we don't have that clogging going on. We didn't get a chance to test that, but it is an option that is available in Horizons.
And specifically about provisioning large amounts of them, yes, we did unfortunately run into that problem. The first time we did it super wrong, we were running not off the SAN, but local disks. And then we tried to provision all 3 pools on a 7K disk. So we had nearly 10 machines trying to come up all at once. And it actually timed out that it took so long to provision them, it finally said, no, we're not doing this. And they just all dropped. So it's definitely something that can be a concern. Obviously, hopefully next semester it won't be, because we're getting a brand new flash array that's going to be super nice. Pretty excited for that. But it is definitely something that has to be monitored, and it definitely would behoove whoever is doing the actual administration to know if you're going to be spinning up large pools and section them out so you don't run into those errors.
In the end, do you like Horizons and VMware's implementation of VDI?
I think it's a really nice implementation. I would have liked to, but if we had more time, I would have liked to explore some of the other things like those RDS apps. One of the things that I found interesting is we looked at that kiosk desktop being able to just launch Chrome with those RDS applications. I think if you properly configured it on a thin client, we could actually make it so that pool wouldn't even have to exist, which I thought was really interesting. All right, well, thank you so much, everybody.